The night after the hanging, Sheriff Daniel Harrow heard footsteps outside his door. Slow, measured, boots on wooden planks. He opened the door with a revolver in his hand, but the street was empty. The gallows in the distance swayed gently. In the wind, the rope still tied where an innocent man had died. And deep inside, the sheriff already feared the truth. The wrong man had swung. Greyford was the kind of town where justice was supposed to be simple. A small, dust-colored settlement tucked between dry hills and endless prairie, where everyone knew each other's name and every crime felt personal. For nearly 15 years, Sheriff Daniel Harrow had been the man people trusted to keep that justice clean and firm. He was not known as a cruel man, nor a reckless one, Harrow believed. Then law, the way a preacher believes in Scripture. Clear lines between right and wrong, guilt and innocence. When trouble came to Greyford, people didn't panic. They waited for the sheriff. So when the murder happened, the town expected Harrow to solve it quickly, and he did. A local shopkeeper named William Carter was found dead behind his store. A single bullet through his chest. Witnesses claimed they had seen a drifter arguing with him earlier that evening. A quiet, tired-looking man named Elias Boone, who had arrived in town only 2 days before. The evidence seemed to fall neatly into place. Boone's revolver had been fired recently. His coat carried gunpowder stains. And he had no family, no reputation, no one willing to defend him. In towns like Greyford, strangers rarely received the benefit of doubt. The trial lasted less than a day. 12 jurors. One exhausted defense. Sheriff Harrow himself testified about the weapon and the witness accounts. When the verdict came, guilty, few in the courtroom seemed surprised. 3 days later, beneath a pale morning sky, Elias Boone stood on the gallows while the town gathered in uneasy silence. He didn't fight, he didn't beg. The only strange thing he did was look directly at Sheriff Harrow and say quietly, "You're making a mistake." The trapdoor opened moments later, and the town of Greyford believed justice had been done. But justice, as Sheriff Harrow would soon discover, does not always stay buried. Long before the hanging in Greyford, Sheriff Daniel Harrow had built a reputation that most lawmen could only dream of. He was not the fastest draw in the territory, nor the most feared. What made people trust him was something quieter, his patience. Harrow was known for listening longer than he spoke, for studying a situation before reaching for his gun or his badge. Years earlier, when the railroad first carved its way through the region, crime had followed closely behind it. Drift gamblers and desperate men poured into the small towns of the frontier, bringing with them violence that the old settlements were not prepared to handle. Greyford had nearly become one of those places swallowed by chaos, until Harrow stepped forward. At the time, he was just a deputy, a former cavalryman who had returned from war with a tired face and a firm belief that order was the only thing keeping the frontier from collapsing into bloodshed. When the previous sheriff was killed during a robbery attempt, the town council asked Harrow to take the badge. He didn't accept immediately. For 2 days he walked the dusty streets of Greyford, speaking with store owners, ranchers, and laborers. When he finally agreed, he told them something simple. Justice must never be rushed. For years he lived by that promise. Under Harrow's watch, violence in Greyford slowly faded. He stopped drunken gunfights before they turned deadly, tracked cattle thieves across miles of desert, and once spent 3 weeks following a bandit trail just to recover a stolen family heirloom. The townspeople admired him, not because he was ruthless, but because he seemed fair. Even the men he arrested often admitted that Harrow treated them with a strange kind of respect. Yet fairness on the frontier was fragile. By the time Elias Boone arrived in Greyford, the town had changed. The railroad had made it busier, louder, and more impatient. New businesses opened, more travelers passed through, and the pressure on Harrow's office grew heavier every month. The murder of William Carter was the first killing in Greyford in nearly 5 years, and the town reacted with fear that bordered on anger. Carter had been well liked, a quiet shopkeeper who extended credit to struggling ranchers and always kept his store lights burning late into the night. His death shook the town deeply. People wanted answers quickly, and they wanted someone to blame even faster. When witnesses pointed to Elias Boone, the stranger with a worn coat and no past anyone could verify, suspicion spread like wildfire. Boone had arrived alone on a freight wagon, paid for a cheap room above the saloon, and spent most of his time walking the town's outskirts. He spoke little and kept his eyes low, which only made people distrust him more. Sheriff Harrow noticed the tension building immediately. Crowds gathered outside the jail even before Boone had been formally charged. Whispering that a drifter's life meant less than a citizen's safety, Harrow knew how easily frontier towns could turn into mobs. That fear pushed him into something he rarely allowed himself to do: move faster than his instincts preferred. Evidence was collected quickly. Witness statements were taken in a single afternoon. Boone insisted he had argued with Carter over a misunderstanding about supplies, but claimed he left the shop alive. He repeated the same sentence again and again during questioning. "I didn't kill that man." Normally, Harrow would have searched for more proof, more certainty, more time. But the town's pressure was heavy, and the evidence seemed convincing enough. The revolver, the witnesses, the timing, it all formed a story that looked complete. By the time the trial ended and the rope was tied at the gallows, Sheriff Daniel Harrow believed he had done what the law demanded. What he didn't know was that the law had just asked him to destroy an innocent man. For the first 2 nights after the hanging, Sheriff Daniel Harrow told himself the footsteps were nothing. Old wood shifted in the cold desert wind all the time. The boardwalk outside his office had been there for decades, its planks loose and uneven from years of boots, horses, and wagons. Sounds traveled strangely at night. In Greyford, wind pushed dust through the empty streets, swinging signs and rattling shutters. A man could hear things that weren't truly there. That was what Harrow repeated to himself as he sat alone at his desk long after midnight, the lantern light casting slow shadows along the walls. But the footsteps returned the 3rd night. Slow, measured. The sound of boots walking across wood with quiet, deliberate weight. Harrow froze when he heard them. They stopped directly outside his door. For several seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then came a single creak, like someone shifting their stance just beyond the frame. The sheriff rose slowly from his chair and reached for his revolver. His heart beat harder than it had during any gunfight he could remember. When he opened the door, the street was empty again. The gallows stood at the far end of town, barely visible under the pale glow of the moon. The rope still hung there, swaying slightly in the wind. Harrow stared at it longer than he meant to. The image of Elias Boone standing beneath that rope returned to him with unsettling clarity. The man's face had not shown fear. That was the detail Harrow couldn't forget. Most men begged when they faced the noose. Boone hadn't. He had simply looked at the sheriff with tired, steady eyes and said those quiet words, "You're making a mistake." At the time, Harrow had dismissed it as the last defense of a desperate man. But the memory began to grow heavier with every passing night. By the end of the week, the footsteps had become a routine part of the sheriff's evenings. Always the same pattern. A slow approach along the boardwalk. A pause outside the door. Then silence. Harrow began opening the door sooner each night. hoping to catch whoever was playing the trick. Yet the street remained empty every time. Not a single person in Greyford admitted to walking past the sheriff's office at those hours. Some nights, Harrow even stepped outside and walked the entire length of the street himself, scanning the dark alleys between buildings. The town would be silent, the windows dark, the desert wind the only movement in the distance. Still, the sound kept coming back. The lack of sleep began wearing him down. Lines deepened across his face, and his patience shortened with the townspeople who visited his office during the day. Something inside him was shifting, a quiet unease that he struggled to explain. Then, 8 days after the hanging, a letter arrived from a nearby mining camp. Instead, the words in sight made his hands go completely still. The letter described a fight that had taken place 2 nights before William Carter was murdered. According to the writer, Dern had been carrying a revolver with a unique silver notch carved into the grip mark, identical to the bullet casing found behind Carter's shop. Outside, the town of Greyford continued its quiet afternoon as if nothing had changed. But inside the sheriff's office, a terrible possibility had just taken shape. The man they had hanged might not have been the killer at all. The footsteps returned. Sheriff Daniel Harrow did not sleep the night he received the letter. He sat alone in his office with the lantern burning low, the folded paper resting on the desk in front of him like a quiet accusation. But they didn't. The name written there, Caleb Dern, kept echoing in his mind. Dern was a gambler who moved between mining towns and rail camps, the kind of man who left trouble behind wherever he went. He had passed through Greyford once months earlier, long before the murder, and Harrow remembered warning him to keep his distance from the town's businesses. At the time, Dern had simply smiled and tipped his hat before disappearing down the road. Now that memory returned with a sharp, bitter edge. The witness statements, the revolver taken from Elias Boone, the report describing the bullet casing found behind Carter's store, something that once looked clear now felt uncertain. Boone's revolver had been fired recently, but so had dozens of guns in Greyford that week. The witnesses had seen Boone arguing with Carter, but no one had actually seen a shot fired. The case had seemed strong because everyone wanted it to be strong. A slow realization began pressing down on Harrow's chest. The sheriff closed his eyes for a moment, and the memory of the gallows returned with painful clarity. The wooden platform. The quiet crowd gathered in the square. Elias Boone standing with the rope around his neck, looking tired but calm. Now, they echoed louder than any gunshot. Harrow didn't reach for his revolver this time. Instead, he sat still, listening as the footsteps approached the door and stopped. Harrow stared at it for a long moment before speaking, aloud, though no one stood there to hear him. If the letter was true, then Greyford had executed the wrong man, and Sheriff Daniel Harrow had been the one to place the rope around his neck. The morning after the realization settled in, without assumptions. But this time, the work felt heavier. Every document he reopened carried the quiet weight of Elias Boone's final words. Harrow revisited the witness statements first. He spoke again with the men who claimed they had seen Boone arguing with William Carter behind the store that night. Their stories had not changed, but the details around them felt thinner than before. One man admitted he had already been halfway down the street when he heard the gunshot. In the rush of the investigation, that had been locked in the evidence cabinet since the trial, its metal dull under the lantern light, when he placed it on the desk. At the time, the claim sounded like an excuse. Now, it sounded painfully possible. The deeper Harrow looked, the clearer the truth became. The case against Boone had been built from pressure, fear, and assumptions. None of it had truly proven murder. By the end of the second day, the sheriff rode out of Greyford, following the lead in the letter. The trail toward the mining camps was dry and long, stretching through miles of empty desert where wind carved lines through the dust. Harrow traveled alone, his thoughts turning darker with every mile. The image of the gallows followed him like a shadow. 2 days later, he reached a rough settlement outside the mines, where gamblers, laborers, and drifters filled the saloons each night. It did not take long to find Caleb Dern. The man was exactly the kind Harrow remembered: confident, sharp-eyed, and careless after too much whiskey. When Harrow entered the saloon, several men glanced toward the sheriff's badge, but Dern only leaned back in his chair and smiled, as if the visit amused him. The conversation that followed was quiet but tense. At first, Dern denied ever returning to Greyford, claiming he had been working the mining camps for weeks. But Harrow noticed the revolver resting on the table beside him. The grip carried a thin silver notch carved into the wood, the same mark described in the letter. When Harrow asked about it, the gambler's expression shifted for just a moment, barely noticeable, but enough. The sheriff pressed harder. Witnesses in the saloon slowly began recalling a drunken story Dern had told nights earlier about a shopkeeper who refused to extend him credit. The story had ended with laughter and a careless brag that the problem had been settled by the time Harrow returned to Greyford with Dern in chains. The truth was no longer uncertain. Caleb Dern had killed William Carter during a heated argument behind the store, fired a single shot, and fled town before anyone noticed. Elias Boone had simply been the stranger unlucky enough to argue with the victim earlier that evening. The real killer now sat in the Greyford jail cell that Boone had once occupied. But the victory felt hollow. When word spread through the town, the streets filled with whispers instead of celebration. The people of Greyford had trusted the law to protect them. Now they understood that the law had taken an innocent life. And every night, after Harrow returned, the footsteps outside his door grew louder. The confession came 3 nights after Caleb Dern was locked inside the Greyford jail. By then, the entire town had fallen into a strange silence that Sheriff Daniel Harrow had never felt before. People still walked the streets, businesses still opened each morning, but the usual greetings and casual conversations had disappeared. When Harrow passed by, many residents lowered their eyes or simply turned away. They did not accuse him directly, but the weight of their quiet disappointment followed him everywhere. Inside the jail cell, Caleb Dern eventually realized the evidence against him was too strong to deny. Witnesses from the mining camp had come forward, describing the drunken bragging. The revolver with the silver notch matched the bullet recovered behind William Carter's store. Under questioning, Dern's arrogance slowly collapsed into resignation. The story he told was ugly in its simplicity. He had gone to Carter's shop late at night, looking for supplies and credit. He knew the shopkeeper would refuse. The argument grew louder, and in a moment of anger, Dern pulled his revolver. Carter tried to force him out the back door. The gun fired once. Dern panicked and rode out of Greyford before dawn, believing no one had seen him. By the time the sheriff finished writing the statement, the room felt unbearably quiet. The truth now sat plainly on paper. Elias Boone had never fired the fatal shot. When Harrow stepped outside the jail that evening, the sun was sinking behind the dry hills, casting long shadows across the empty square. At the far end of the street, the gallows still stood, exactly where they had been left after the execution. The rope had not yet been removed. No one in town had volunteered to take it down. Harrow walked toward it slowly. Every step across the dirt felt heavier than the last. The platform creaked softly when he climbed onto it, the wood worn smooth by years of use. He reached up and placed a hand on the rope. For a moment, he could almost see Boone standing there. Again the calm expression, the steady eyes, the the quiet certainty in his voice. "You're making a mistake?" The sheriff closed his eyes. Behind him, the town remained silent. That night, Harrow returned to his office later than usual. He sat alone in the dim lantern light. The written confession lying on his desk beside the execution record, bearing his own signature. The documents separated by only days. Yet they told completely different stories. Near midnight, the familiar sound came again. Boots on wood, the footsteps moved slowly along the boardwalk. Toward the door, Harrow did not hesitate this time. He stood and walked forward as the sound stopped just outside the frame, his hand resting against the handle. Then he opened it. The street was empty once again, the moonlight stretching across the silent buildings. But Harrow did not search the shadows like he had before. Instead, he stepped outside and looked toward the gallows at the end of the street. The rope swayed gently in the night air, and for the first time, the sheriff understood something he had been avoiding since the moment the truth surfaced. The footsteps were not coming for revenge. They were a reminder that justice had been rushed, that an innocent man had died because the law had chosen certainty over patience. Sheriff Daniel Harrow stood alone in the empty street, listening to the silence where the footsteps had been, and he realized that the sound would probably follow him for the rest of his life. Asterisk in the days that followed, Sheriff Daniel Harrow did something the people of Greyford had never seen a lawman do before. He called the entire town to gather in the square. Word spread quietly through the streets until ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, and families slowly filled the space beneath the pale afternoon sky. At the far end of the square stood the gallows where Elias Boone had died. Harrow walked toward the platform alone, carrying a folded document in his hand. His face looked older than it had only weeks earlier. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the weight of sleepless nights clearly written across his expression. When he climbed onto the wooden platform, the crowd fell silent. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he read the confession of Caleb. Dern aloud. The words traveled through the still air plain and undeniable. By the time he finished, everyone in Greyford understood what had happened. The man they had watched die had never been the killer. Harrow did not try to excuse himself. He told them that the responsibility belonged to him, because justice demanded patience and the law had trusted his judgment, and his judgment had ended a life that could never be returned. When he finished speaking, Harrow reached up and untied the rope from the gallows beam. The thick coil fell heavily into his hands without another word. He carried it down the steps and placed it inside a wooden crate beside the platform. The gallows would remain standing as a reminder, but the rope would never be used again. The town felt quieter than ever, but it carried understanding instead of denial. No footsteps came to the door. Sheriff Daniel Harrow sat alone in that silence, knowing the memory of Elias Boone would never truly leave him, but perhaps the reminder had finally been heard. Justice is not only about catching the guilty. Sometimes it is about having the courage to admit when the law itself has failed. If this story made you think, consider subscribing for more true-to-life frontier stories, where every decision carries a consequence.